Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As we stated earlier, we are going to get started promptly here. So we will still have some individuals that will be joining us here for the next minute or two, but we, again, do want to make sure that we use as much of our time today as possible. Thank you again for joining. My name is Anthony Salas, and on behalf of Welcoming America, I would like to welcome you to a conversation on the state of race in America. And before we do get started, just want to go over a few housekeeping items with you. If you have any questions as the time goes on today, please use the chat feature and enter your question, or if you need any technical assistance as well, you can use that chat feature and we'll respond to you as soon as possible. As you can see also on the screen, just giving you an idea as to what to expect for the next 90 minutes. I'll be turning things over here shortly to our executive director, Rachel, who will introduce herself and give some welcome statements to kick us off, followed by a discussion with our member panelists. We'll then move into some smaller virtual breakout rooms where each of you will have the chance to have a discussion with a few of your attendee neighbors who will be joining us today. And then we'll come back out into the larger room that we're in here to do a quick recap of the rooms before closing out. So just wanted to give you an idea as what to expect today. And at this point, it is my great pleasure to turn things over to our executive director, Rachel Peric.
Thank you so much, Anthony, and thank you to all of you who are on the call today. It's great to see, to virtually see everybody with us today, and I know you are all stepping away from very busy lives, and glad you're here for this important conversation. I thought that maybe we could start off our call today, particularly since the funeral for George Floyd is happening today, happening now, in fact, that maybe we could start with just a moment of silence for him, for all the victims of police violence, of bigotry, and to honor his family's calls for justice. So let's just take a moment to bow our heads in silence. Thank you. Thank you. And if you're just joining us, we just had a moment of silence. You know, I was thinking as I was getting ready for this call today about the funeral that I wish was happening today. And that funeral is really a funeral for white supremacy. A funeral for white supremacy as a dangerous, outmoded, belief system that there is some hierarchy of human value. Not only so that we could go on to stop the suffering of so many people that othering and bigotry and racism create, but really so that we could reach our society's potential and our community's potential. And that really has always been, you know, so core to the idea of being welcoming, that it's not just about being welcoming of newcomers, of immigrants, but really of being welcoming of all residents, and about everybody's being able to belong, everybody's being able to participate. But I think at the same time, it's also a really critical moment for us to examine, are we living up to that? Our communities, you know, really living up to the potential of being truly welcoming for everyone. And I know that that is not an easy task, and many of you are wrestling with that in your communities, and we're here today to talk about that and find some support for one another, and also to hear from some of your peers. But I will say that welcoming communities have always, through our members, through leaders, have always set the standard for what it means to be truly welcoming. And I am convinced that what we will see in coming years is an evolution of that standard. And that those that will shape it are those of you who are on this call today. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have, to the work that's ahead, and to digging in to what can be a difficult conversation, but also a critically important one. And so with that, I want to just quickly introduce our three speakers today, and deeply, deeply thank them for their time in joining us. And first we have Jessica Ruffin, who is Senior Leader of Equity and Inclusion with the Department of Human Services in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. She previously served on Mayor Peduto's Pittsburgh Human Rights Commission. And we're really delighted to have her. As many of you know, and were present at Pittsburgh, was our last Welcoming Interactive host. I'm also pleased to introduce what was to be this year's host and what will be next year's host with the City of Charlotte for Welcoming Interactive, and that's Federico Rios, who is the Assistant Director of the Office of Equity, Mobility, and Immigrant Integration with the City of Charlotte, North Carolina. And last but not least, veteran welcomer, Christa Yoakum, who is the Senior Welcoming Coordinator with Nebraska is Home and with the Nebraska Appleseed Immigrants and Communities Program. And she is also a member of the Lancaster County, Nebraska Board of Commissioners. And maybe where we can begin with the three of you is just to hear a little bit about what's been happening in your communities. So let's start with Jessica. And maybe you can just share with us a little bit about some of the activations you've been seeing, who's been involved, and then a little bit about what your hopes and maybe some concerns are. Jessica?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I mean, we're about day 10 into protests here in the county, and things have been going well. We got off to kind of a rocky start. It became very clear that we had some folks that had no interest in supporting the movement involved to just incite some violence. And I'm happy to say that our elected officials and folks that were on the police force kind of handled and squelched those attempts fairly quickly. And so for the most part, we have had fairly peaceful protests. As always, we have, young people leading the charge, which is just so awesome to see just the young adults doing it. But we're also starting to see folks that traditionally wouldn't get out there, for a lot of different reasons. For initially, it's just exciting just to see the diversity. Most recently, we actually had our representatives from our Pittsburgh Public Schools actually get out and stage their own protest in the hopes of trying to, advance equity and build more inclusive spaces for their students. And so it's exciting to see everyone that's involved. It's exciting to see the collaboration that is happening. It's exciting that, we're finally, we're shedding light on an issue that is very near and dear to Pittsburgh. It wasn't long ago before we lost a young person to gun violence, and in a lot of ways we're still recovering from that. It's kind of a reopening of wounds for us. But it feels like folks are starting to pay attention. I hope that the momentum changes, and I really hope that folks start to see this as not just an opportunity to address the challenges within policing, because there are a lot there, and within our criminal justice system overall, but also starting to look at how the systems that they work with or that they administer also support and feed into this. And so this is not just a call to address some of the issues that we're having within our criminal justice system. It needs to also be a call with some of the challenges we have with our education system. It needs to be a call to challenges with our health system and folks' ability to access mental health treatment. And so I just really, really hope that we start to engage in sustained conversations about the roles that we all play, because as we know, racism is deep and it's pervasive and it impacts us all. And at some point in our lives, we've all been players in it. And so the time is up, and we really need to just really start to work to address that and take some responsibility.
Thank you. And I'm definitely going to want to come back to the word you use, sustained, and what that looks like. But maybe we can go now to Federico and just hear from you a little bit about what's been happening in Charlotte.
Rachel, thank you, and thank you to Welcoming America for the opportunity to present. So today will be our 12th day of activations, protests occurring in Charlotte. We had a bit of a rocky start. Actually, the first night of protests occurred in the West End community along Beatty's Ford Road. If anyone out there is familiar with Charlotte, it's a community we actually intended on touring during our hosting of Welcoming America this year. But that community is our historic African American community, disproportionately impacted by heavy policing. And we had some outside groups that weren't very familiar to the activists in town, determined that they were going to do protests down that corridor, which ran contrary to the way that things are typically done in Charlotte. So that was a really interesting moment, to say the least. And it showed the stark reality on where we go and where we make our voice heard and what occurs from those moments. In community, we're seeing a great deal of diversity amongst the individuals that are coming out. I will say that as compared to protests that we saw occur in 2016, after the shooting death of an individual here in Charlotte named Keith Lamont Scott at the hands of police, that protest was much smaller and was much more made up of African American and Latino persons, whereas this protest also has those groups, but a large contingency of Caucasian individuals as well. And so there's a lot more people. It's more diverse, and we've seen some policy action come from the movement. And so after 12 days of consistent protesting, 11 of those days occurring in what we call Uptown Charlotte, our center city, last night our city council passed a resolution to disallow the use of chemical agents moving forward into our next budget year, into 2021's budget year, to do away with the stockpile we currently have and to not allocate funds any longer for chemical agents. So you see that the movement has now had a policy attached to it. And council members were very forthright last night in sharing that they, in the budget process, had never received 4,000 emails regarding something related to budget. And so it was really people coming together and pushing for this change that saw it come forth. So, my hopes are that this will not be a stop point, that people out in the community going out to protest will not think that they have arrived because a policy decision has been made, when in fact several need to occur, and a whole systemic, we really need to look systemically at everything that is occurring and make decisions around what policies we feel are valuable, and where our morals direct us on how we police in this community. And so I do have hope. I think last night was an indication that we can make change happen if we all rally together. And I think we're well on our way.
It's great to hear all of that. Lots of silver linings in this moment, and lots of momentum to keep building on. Christa, tell us what you're seeing in Nebraska.
Yeah, so because I wear different hats here in this community, I'll talk from a few different perspectives. Lincoln and Omaha are our largest populated cities, and that is where the largest concentration of diversity is, and longstanding Black communities. And we saw action in those two communities, as you might imagine, first. And that was last Friday. Saturday and Sunday were definitely very violent protests late into the night. They became violent in both Lincoln and Omaha. In fact, there was a murder in Omaha of a bar owner, a white bar owner trying to defend his property. Actually was not at the bar because they've been closed due to COVID, right? Came to the bar with a gun, and there was a black man, unarmed black man, that was shot at that time. That caused controversy. The county attorney who would have prosecuted that case is typically very respected from everyone, and he chose not to prosecute that. He felt that it was self-defense. because of public outcry, there will now be a grand jury called to investigate that. And in Lincoln and Omaha, we're seeing some really good changes. Initially, there was, by the third day of violence, fourth day of violence, there were some behind the scenes meetings among some of the, like the Black Community Center here that's been in Lincoln, that's been here for over 50 years and is really instrumental to a lot of change that's happened in the community over the years. Police met with them. They formed a citizens advisory committee. They'll be meeting on a regular basis. They enrolled that with a, they had a strategic meeting. They had a press conference, and we ended up on Jimmy Kimmel that night because they ended up dancing the Cupid Shuffle together. Now, a lot of people thought that was just performative though, and what will be the meat behind that? I feel that this will, because I know some of the people involved, that we will have some good long-term change, and it will be a good check on police action coming from that. In both Lincoln and Omaha, the cities had already started to move forward a hate intimidation ordinance, which is not quite to the level of hate crime, because there is that federal level, but it's, if a true crime has not happened, but someone has used hate for intimidation purposes, that could be prosecuted now. Lincoln held the first hearing on that last night, allowed for more than an hour of public testimony, which I was glad for. Omaha's has not come before the city council yet. Our legislative judiciary committee held a listening session that started at 9 a.m. yesterday and went until after 7 p.m. last night in Omaha. They're doing the same as we speak here in Lincoln. I don't remember, well, actually the last time I remember our judiciary committee coming out of the chambers and into the community for hearings was when we did redistricting 10 years ago. So to me, those are big moves, right? We also had, and this is what makes me feel good about positive changes, we had marches all across the state. There was one older white individual standing with a sign in a busy intersection in a small town of less than 10,000 people. In a town of Harvard, Nebraska, population about 800 people, they had a peaceful protest. In Grand Island, people did a die-in in the park. And so those movements, it's going to take our rural communities coming along with our more urban communities to really make change. And then I did want to note, Jessica talked about some of the young people leading this. Even though it's been quieter now for 3 days, I believe it's been much quieter here in the Lincoln and Omaha areas. I was fortunate to be invited by some of those young people into one of their meetings, and wow, was I impressed at the way they were looking at systemic change. And it wasn't just law enforcement. They were looking at early childhood education, mental health services, all of those things. And I was glad to just be able to plug them in to some other resources. And I think that's also where we get change, right? Is some of these long-standing boards and commissions for diversity and that sort of thing have become tired. And they're more grass tops sorts of people, and they are not necessarily in the community. And so making room for people who are truly in the community having these experiences gives me hope that we're going to have some good change.
Thank you, Christa, and it gives me a lot of hope too. And I'll say, being here in the DC area and just participating in some of the actions and just seeing this new generation of leaders who are so ready to take on those roles. And I think that, combined with my feed, has just been blowing up with so many communities talking about aspirationally wanting to be welcoming. And so the next question I want to ask you, as keepers of what it means to be a welcoming community, how are you thinking about what welcoming or how welcoming needs to expand in order to live into this moment? And maybe we can start with Federico and then go to Jessica and Christa.
So I'll say that this has furthered a concept that's already come to pass with the city. So you'll see that the title under my name states that it's the Office of Equity, Mobility, and Immigrant Integration. There was this recognition last year that what was the Office of International Relations had to expand its scope. We had to see that all of these things were intertwined, interconnected, and interdependent. And so I think it's really important for me as I conceptualize the path forward for the city of Charlotte and my office to really ensure that as we discuss matters related to our immigrant and refugee community, that we center it in the African American experience, that we really recognize that so many of the tensions, so many of the issues that are faced within the refugee and immigrant community are born out of what has historically occurred with African American communities, what continues to occur within African American communities. And the other piece is really utilizing this platform to bring out what really has been racism amongst immigrant and refugee groups as well, and how they view the African American community. I had an opportunity to sit on a really poignant discussion hosted by a local nonprofit, the Latin American Coalition, where we talked about racism within the Latino community and how that shows up. And really, I think at this moment, every group has to really look at itself and determine, why do I hold these things to be true? Why do I perceive things this way? To dismantle their own individual racism and therefore be able to move forward with the work to collaborate with other groups. It's been incredibly difficult to get just immigrants across the board to partner. But I recognize that it's really necessary that we work with our immigrant and African American community in tandem at this point. The last piece I'll share, again, one of those anecdotes that the light bulb went off for me. We spent a great deal of time last year working with our mayor and city council on an immigrant community committee in response to immigration and custom enforcement coming into our community and exercising some really difficult tactics, some things that really brought fear into the community. And so as we were going through this process, we created a document that was patterned after some work that New American Economies has done, and it's this immigrant compact. And so we create this compact and we present it to city council, and one of our city council members said, "This is great. When do we get a compact for the African American community?" And it was this recognition that we're doing so much seemingly in one space and we're not doing it across spaces. We're not ensuring that we're looking at everything from an equity lens. And so it again refocused our energies and made it clear that this office can't just tackle what one group needs. It really has to look holistically at what the city as a whole needs.
Thanks, Federico. And I think one of the things that is at least from an outside perspective, terrific about how Charlotte is structured right now is that it's structured to make that a holistic conversation. And not every community has the structure, at least within city government, to be thinking about it in that comprehensive way. To me, that's the future. That's where the work needs to head. But would love for you to comment on that when we come back to you. And Jessica or Christa, do one of you want to jump in here to share a little bit of your own reflections on how welcoming needs to expand?
Well, if you don't mind, I would, if that's okay with you, Jessica. Because that's where I started, was in that immigrants and refugees welcoming space, right? And it was a space that it felt like, we were having some challenging conversations, certainly in communities, but they weren't quite as deep as where we're going now, right? And we've shifted, really it's been the last couple of years that we've really focused a lot more on race equity work in that, and really shifted our message from being welcoming to immigrants and refugees to creating communities where everyone feels like they belong. And in this moment, that's indeed exactly what we need to have happen. So as far as the welcoming work, that really has been our focus. We take race equity trainings into the community where people are. We had a state senator proposed legislation this year to add 2 additional hours of race equity training for all law enforcement. And my initial pushback that I got from our Lincoln and Omaha say, "Oh, we're already doing it. We've got it. I'm saying, well, let's look at that and see what that is. But in our smaller communities, they're saying it's a matter of resources, and that they know they need to do it, they want to do it, they just can't. And so in that respect, we're looking for how can we get put it in their hands, make it so they do it. In my opinion, to a certain extent, coming from the governmental side, it's what are your priorities? You can figure out how to make it happen. But that, from my nonprofit side, that's a little harder for me to tell law enforcement to do if they're not under my jurisdiction, right? So I think it is, we can be those messengers for more of this race equity work. And I find myself in doing this in rural communities as a white woman born in Nebraska. Oftentimes I can start that conversation, and the more rural community members will hear it from me first, because we speak a similar language. I look like they look, and they'll accept it from me, and then we have to make that conversation go a bit deeper. And that's really how we create these communities where everyone does feel like they belong and everyone feels valued.
Thank you, Christa. Jessica, how about for you?
Right. I don't have too much to add to that. I think I agree with both of their sentiments. I mean, one of the first things that I jotted down when I saw the list of questions were really around tools to support cross-racial solidarity and education. For all of the reasons we named before, I mean, when we think about the way that oppression, and particularly racial oppression, works, if there's a part of that that seeks to divide and conquer, right? And so I just often think about how powerful it would be if we could consistently come together for collective impact and show up for each other, because it's all interconnected, and we're not going to be able to overcome some of the things that we face in the Black community if we don't bring along, our colleagues from other immigrant and refugee communities, and vice versa. So again, don't want to take up too much time repeating all the reasons why, but that was the first thing that came to my mind as a really good place for welcoming America, to just to support efforts and to provide tools and resources that can help us to do that.
Thank you. Jessica, before we come back to you, I think we're having a little bit of challenge with your microphone. Can mostly hear you, but if that's something that you're able to fix, that would be great. I think just to build on that, I'm curious what kinds of examples of cross-racial, cross-group activations or just solidarity you're seeing now, and maybe some thoughts on how we keep building on that. And anyone who wants to jump in with that, please feel free.
Last Sunday, in the prior Sunday, a week ago Sunday, in Lincoln, Nebraska, I went down to the Capitol for an event, for one of the Black Lives Matter events. There was a missing and murdered Indigenous women march prior to that. I think that started at noon. At 1 o'clock, there was a stand-in for solidarity for meatpacking workers. And there were a lot of our Latino community members who were speaking there. And immediately following that was the Black Lives Matter rally. Whoever did the setup for the first event left the sound system. Let's all do this together. Let's be together all day. And seeing that support for one another's movement was beautiful. On, I don't remember which day, the Tuesday, there was an event at the Indian Center here, and they brought everyone into the powwow circle, and a couple of the elders explained a lot of their traditions, and then they brought many of those young organizers that have been organizing the Black Lives Matter rallies on a daily basis into the powwow circle and explained what it meant to be a warrior in their community, in their native culture, and then pronounced that all of those young people were warriors. And I've seen a lot of those kinds of things throughout the week. I've seen young people taking care of each other at events, making sure everybody has water and everybody has a sandwich and those sorts of things. And so I feel like we've got a moment here that we certainly can work with. I think it can be challenging as everybody goes back to daily lives, et cetera, to keep that momentum going. But I think it's incumbent on us to make that happen.
It's absolutely a call to action. Jessica, Federico, what are your thoughts around what you're seeing and how we leverage it going forward?
I apologize. I turned off my camera in the hopes that it's better. Can you hear me? Is the
Much
sound?
better now. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm having issues with my computer today. Yeah, I mean, I think we saw a great example this past weekend. I apologize, my days are kind of meshing together, where we actually, there was a proposal to start a protest in a primarily Latinx community that also has a number of undocumented families living there. And we immediately saw some great activation and collaboration where the start of the protest was moved. I mean, it was, determined that that was potentially putting people at risk and increasing their vulnerability, and the protest coordinators just said okay, and they moved it about a mile away just to avoid it. And you still have members from that community show up and march alongside in solidarity. And so, I'm hoping that that type of energy remains, and we're able to maintain that, where folks are, I think one of the biggest challenges that folks just don't typically communicate with each other and feel like they just kind of have to live on their own in their own island. And so just like as Christa mentioned, just that moment where you're just, people speak their, when you create space for people to speak their opinions and also to voice their concerns, that oftentimes people are able to be responsive and also could move so that they can, fit the needs of others. And so, at least for me, that was just a great moment, because we often here in our county, and more specifically within the city of Pittsburgh limits, often talk about the importance of Black-Brown solidarity. And I just saw that, it just was just a perfect example of it in action over the weekend. And I think it ends up being one of our largest protests, actually, that resulted in a pretty powerful die-in in front of our county jail. And so it was just great to see it all come together, and folks were able to remain safe. So
Terrific. Federico, how about you?
I mean, yeah, we've seen the same. We've seen a great deal of diversity amongst the protesters. We've seen some connectivity where maybe there has not been some. I would say what stood out for me is we're not a community that's really well known for our organizing. In fact, you can make the case that we don't funnel a lot of dollars as a community into organizing. And so there's a lot of challenges with having everyone on the same page when it comes to organizing. And it's been amazing to see so many organizers that focus on so many different areas, whether that's labor rights, immigrant rights, coming together for this one cause. And it's great to see that level of collaboration. I think we're at a tipping point where people will see that there is power in collaboration. There is collective impact that will come from it, and that in turn we all benefit.
That's great. And if you haven't seen it, there's a great new report out by the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy on the philanthropic dollars state by state that are going into both immigrant justice organizing as well as services, which is specific to the immigrant rights movement. But I think for those doing this work and talking to philanthropy about the power of advocacy and what dollars are actually going to support it, may have some helpful things to help you make your case. I want to just talk tactically now about what the future holds, and you all may not even know that yet. I think a lot of us are still in a period of deep reflection, but I've been seeing the group chat lighting up as people share not only where they're from, but some of their specific needs and maybe some specific offers here. And I wonder if maybe each of you could just say a little bit about some of the things that are on your checklists, or what should be on your community's checklists in the coming months. Would anyone like to jump in first?
So I'll mention City Council has also taken upon themselves to align themselves with the 8 Can't Wait campaign, which gives 8 things that communities can do to improve policing. I think there's a larger discussion to be had around police reform as a whole. How is it that we as a community choose to really provide community safety versus what we've often seen, which has been abuses of power? So again, we had that policy change just happened last night. I feel like we will continue to see this. My hope is that protesters will not stop. I saw a meme recently, and I know memes aren't the best focal points for facts, but it said, you know, the major protests that have occurred in our community have taken months, not weeks, and in some instances years. And so I hope that we will continue as a community to continue to centralize these issues and see real change coming from it. I can't say that I can think of a time in my own life where I've seen such a recognition of the challenge and such a rapid progression to want to move forward change. And so I'm heartened by that. I think we're in a good place. I think my office is set up to assist with that piece and to ensure that we're applying an equity lens as we change policy.
Terrific, thank you.
Right, I can go next. So last year, the city of Pittsburgh, the city council actually declared racism a public health epidemic, and our county government actually followed about a month ago. Our county council voted at it, so it's fairly new, and I think I'm hoping that this moment encourages some momentum to really start those discussions. I mean, so when you think about it from a public health perspective, there's a process where you're actually diagnosing the condition, and then you're treating it or forming some sort of intervention, and then it moves on to prevention. And when you think about all the players that are at the table right now, when we think about this, I mean, you're looking at policing, you're looking at, again, like the healthcare systems, you're looking at just the way that the government interacts. There's so much opportunity there, and so I'm just really hoping that this, again, that we just take advantage of this moment and make some action. I also think that the proximity of this happening to COVID-19 is also an opportunity there, because when, you know, we originally got our stay-at-home orders, it was amazing to see, you know, all hands on deck. I mean, everybody was there, everybody was lending their perspective around how we could modify, at least within the human services in the public health realm, like how do we need to modify the way that we do things so that we can reach the most vulnerable populations. And we engaged in conversations that I don't think have ever happened before around everything from language services to you know, to telehealth and things that you know, 6 months ago folks would have said was impossible. And so when we're thinking about, you know, addressing racism from a public health perspective, and when we're thinking about planning these interventions and these treatments for it, then, you know, we need that type of energy at the table. And so much like Federico, like I hope that people don't stop protesting. You know, we get to a point where, you know, folks get tired, and I get it, but like we have to, you know, keep going and keep the I guess the microscope on this. You know, we don't want to shift. It's going to be so easy to move and shift in other directions, especially because these type of conversations make people so uncomfortable. And so, you know, I'm just hoping that we just take advantage of this moment and start to move some commitments that our region has made forward.
That's great. And I think we can all say amen to that. Christa, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is where I was going to switch my hats a little bit and talk a little bit more with my elected official hat on. And with a shift that I had seen in policing in my community, and certainly this is not widespread, within the last 4 years, and certainly since I've become an elected official and been able to have deeper conversations, I've taken there were probably 25 or better members of our police department and our sheriff's department to some anti-bias, empathy building sorts of things that were happening on campus here. And I really, because of the level of conversation I can have with them, I feel the sincerity in them wanting to do a better job. Within a week or two of having been appointed as a county commissioner, the sheriff, one of the deputy sheriffs came into my office and asked how I could help. They wanted to do better about diversity on their department and the way they operated. And that was a very sincere conversation. And because I've had those sincere conversations, I found myself all of the last week in a very strange place with my activism hat on and wanting to support young people who were painting all law enforcement with the same broad stroke. and knowing where some of our police officers and our law enforcement officers were certainly coming from, to then on Saturday night, a week ago Saturday night, seeing the sheriff's department that I have jurisdiction over actually very forcibly accost some of those members, be very aggressive. And I went from that morning, I'd had a conversation where I was kind of concerned for them. Are you taking care of yourselves? How are you doing? To that evening, picking up the phone and saying, what the hell did I just see? I know now that there is an investigation going on. I know that there will be some action come out of that. I can't speak about that because it's an ongoing investigation. And I so want to give that healing message to the community that there is an investigation going on, but I, can't do that yet. So that's been a hard place for me personally to be in. But I feel the sincerity. I've maybe overused that word because I've said it several times, but I feel the sincerity. I feel like we've got everyone's attention. And I'm committed to looking at funding some other programs that deal with mental health. There are alternatives to incarceration. A lot of those sorts of things. I called for anti-bias training, not just for our law enforcement, but for all of our elected officials and all of our governmental staff. And that will make all of our practices and policies better throughout our organizations. And I think we just have to keep that momentum going, and it's going to take all of us pushing as well, right?
Yes, and I know one of the unique roles that many of you on this call play is being both a force for pushing externally and also a force for pushing internally. And that is not always an easy role to play. And so with that, I know that all of you have interesting things to contribute to this conversation. We want to create some space to get into it. So I'm going to turn things over to Anthony to take us into that part of our call, and just thank you again to all three of our panelists for your incredible work, for just being incredible advocates, and for making the time to join us today.
As mentioned earlier, what we're going to do now is our staff moderators are going to share a recap of the conversations in their respective rooms. So I'm going to, first of all, ask Meg Shoemaker-Little to start us off with a recap of her room.
Sure. I was trying to frantically write up my notes. I knew I'd be called on first. So we talked a little bit about where organizations and offices were in the moment. And I think there was consensus that folks were finding their footing, understanding the role that they could play, thinking about building on different structures or alliances or relationships that had been developed prior to this moment. So that might have been working groups that had been pulled together in response to COVID-19, or interdepartmental relationships and being able to provide support or training through those established relationships. And then talked about different types of leadership in communities, and thinking about the tension between folks who want to work within the system, folks who feel like working within the system might be a trick, that they've been there before, and generally building up leadership for protesters and creating spaces for individual and organizational reflection in this moment and listening.
Great. Thanks so much, Meg. Appreciate your sharing of that information. Let's see, we're going to move on to group 2. Layla, if you'll give us a recap, please.
Yes. So some of the risks that our group has seen and is feeling right now is that one, that many folks don't have a full history of policing and its background and its ties to slavery. So there's maybe no mutual understanding. There isn't like a base of common knowledge. And that there's also risk that the momentum of this will be squandered, that it will die down, and that leaders and others are tearing each other apart instead of working together efficiently to really make change. Some of the possibilities, realistic things that are happening in some of the regions from our group were there was some success, starting to see some successes in alternatives to keeping people in jail and prison, and collaboration with partners, movements within city councils to tackle some of these issues. And the last thing that I will share is that some of the things that need to happen to shift in this moment and what organizations are doing right now. Number one was the relationships have to be built first. And then second is expanding and building partnerships with others in your network. Those were a couple of points.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Layla.
Yeah.
Let's see, we're going to move now to group 3, and that will be Christina.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for the discussion today. So our group was composed of a mix of local governments, nonprofits, a community college, large cities, small cities, but we found some themes in how people are being called upon in this moment. One is being called upon to bring resources to their various constituents in terms of how to act right now, how to look inward, how to move forward from here. Another thing is they're being called upon to convene opportunities to process and digest. So really looking at community dialogues and how to do that during the pandemic. So how to convene community dialogues virtually on race and immigration, and racial justice. And we also talked about both internal and external communications. A lot of our organizations have monthly newsletters, so they've been using those to both send a strong message in this moment, but also to emphasize how we move forward from here and concrete action steps that their constituents can take. So really being called upon to support messaging. And then we also concentrated some time on reflections on the role of racism in Black immigrants' lives and how to build cross-community solidarity between Black immigrants and African Americans specifically, but also immigrants more broadly across races with Black Americans, and looking across movements at cross-community solidarity, as well as some of those tough conversations that are happening between first generation and second generation immigrants and their parents. So assisting with those conversations and processing between generations right now.
Great. Thank you so much, Christina. I appreciate that. And thanks to all your group members as well. Let's see, we're going to move now to group 4, and that is Molly.
Hi all, thanks so much, and thank you to everyone in my group as well. We had a mix of folks from city government and nonprofit as well. One of the things that surfaced right away in our conversation when we were talking about how folks are being called upon in this time was to really deeply think about and talk about police relationships with immigrant and refugee communities. I think one of the roles that many of the folks in our room have played before is helping immigrant and refugee communities in their community have relationships and build relationships between law enforcement, and now really seeing all of the relationships really, I guess, fall apart, and violence really being perpetuated on communities of color has really risen to the top as a concern for some of the folks in immigrant and refugee communities throughout the country. And so I think really thinking about that is really gotten folks together. Another piece that we really delved into right now was while there have been really wonderful moments of solidarity and folks coming together from both the refugee and immigrant communities, the Black communities, Black Lives Matter movement, and some great support from international communities for those movements, and a really, I think, coming together in solidarity there. There's still a large concern that xenophobia and white supremacy and some of these other concepts and outlying movements are also gaining momentum in this particular time. And how do we continue to focus in on relationships within and between groups of folks working to change policy and change narrative in their community, and also continue to confront the xenophobia Asian Americans are facing in this time, and then kind of some of the more broader white supremacy. So, you know, a lot of work to do, but hope and hardworking folks all around.
Great. Thank you, Molly. Appreciate you sharing that. We're going to turn now to group 5, and that'll be Jordan.
Hi. So I think we could probably break our discussion down into 3 kind of areas. First, we talked a bit about just the struggle of trying to figure out where we fit into this work, where direct service agencies that primarily, especially serve immigrants and refugees, what is the, what exactly is the role? How hard should these agencies be pushing, especially pushing within immigrant communities to recognize anti-Blackness and to recognize racism? The second kind of major point we talked about was really just a consensus that this is a special moment, and that the biggest risk that we're faced with is actually not seizing on it as a window of opportunity. And then thirdly, we talked about just a desire to see examples lifted up from communities that have done a good job of bridging African-American and immigrant communities together, whether that's to work on a specific task or whatever it be, but just really kind of a desire to see tangible examples from communities that have been able to intentionally do this work and have some success stories from it.
Thanks so much, Jordan. Appreciate that. All right, group 6, we're going to move now to Melissa.
Hi, everyone. So we had some similar themes to other folks, so not really going to continue to reiterate those, but a couple of things that we did talk about as well. As far as a risk specifically of really understanding that the challenge politically at the federal level of recognizing KKK versus the Antifa as a terrorist organization. And that unfortunately, particularly in a lot of our rural and smaller communities, the KKK and other white supremacist groups are active. And so this work has been ongoing for quite some time. And also, as far as challenges, I think some of the ones that we discussed were really about when an organization or department works closely or directly with the police department, and really determining then how do we navigate this political space. And some of the opportunities that were brought up, I really do want to highlight some internal support at organizations that we deemed micro-inclusions instead of micro-aggressions. And so really ensuring that people have space to take time for themselves, to step away from the work if they need to, and to be engaged civically as well. So really appreciate that. And then also recognizing that unfortunately within organizations and companies that there's still a lot of challenges that they face, even though they've made a commitment to equity and inclusion, yet when we look at their leadership, such as their board and their executive team. It's primarily white men. It's rarely Black, Indigenous, people of color, and that their position is typically relegated to diversity and inclusion when they are there.
So thanks so much, Melissa. I appreciate that. And we'll go ahead and hear from our final group, group 7, George.
Hi, everyone. So our group talked through a few of the questions that that were posed, and what came up was really addressing the intersectionality in the work that we have ahead of us, understanding the root of problems, thinking about how this leads to confronting institutionalized and systemic barriers, externally and most importantly internally as well, which then kind of led to the biggest thing, which was authenticity, creating more authentic alignment within the efforts toward racial equity. So conversations and actions to avoid it being performative, making sure to center racial equity and immigrant inclusion. Thinking about how do we give space to what's going on, engage in needed conversations without taking away from other efforts or other efforts. And then finally reflecting on the workforce that comprises immigrant integration, how we can use the platform and power dynamics to share the stage for those whose perspective can best shape the future of this work.
Awesome. Thank you, George. Thank you so much to everyone. I hope you found these breakout room discussions to be beneficial. And it sounds like there was a lot of really great sharing that happened during this time. We are right at the bottom of our time, so timing is perfect here. But just quickly want to thank all of you for spending your time with us today. We know this was an important conversation for everyone here, and we appreciate you taking the time to be with us. If you would like to continue the conversation, if you have any questions specific to this that you want to pose, since we are out of time, feel free to reach out to us at events@welcomingamerica.org. You can share also any feedback that you'd like to in regards to today's topic or just how the time was spent. We value any kind of feedback, so feel free to do that as well. And again, really appreciate everyone joining us today. Especially want to thank Rachel, Jessica, Christa, and Federico for leading our member panel discussion. And again, all of you for taking the time to kind of do a little bit of a deep dive into this conversation that I hope will lead us to some good steps going forward. Thank you again for joining. I wish you all a great day, a great rest of the week, and a lot of peace and health. Thank you, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.